Throughout your life, you may have heard the saying, there are three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. Well, this case is no different. In 1969, when Senator Ted Kennedy's car hurtled off a bridge in Chappaquiddick Island and his passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, was found dead, the events of that night remain unclear over 50 years later.
Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. It means a lot that you take the time out of your busy day to listen to me ramble on about murder. Of all the true crime podcasts that are out there, and I haven't counted, but it's probably at least 4 or 5, you chose this one, and I appreciate it. If you are new to 10-Minute Murder, welcome. I hope that by the end of this episode, you'll like what you hear and become a subscriber, and then connect with the podcast on all of the social media places. Links for that are in the episode notes, as well as a link to the 10-Minute Murder merch store. I'm not asking you to buy anything, but if you do, please send me a picture when you get it, and I'll share it on social media. Unless you don't want me to, in that case, give me a heads up about that as well. Okay, now before we officially start with today's episode, I need to let you know that despite most of the story involves a very famous politician, it is in no way political. You could fill 2 internets with what I don't know about politics. I mean, I have opinions like everyone else, but that's not what this is about. It is, however, about the death of a lady. The name of this podcast is 10-Minute Murder, but this isn't necessarily a murder. If you don't already know the basics of the story, that's going to make more sense in a minute. So let's get to it. On the evening of July 18th, 1969, Edward, or Ted, Kennedy and his cousin, Joe Gargan, were hosting a cookout and a reunion party at Lawrence Cottage on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts. 6 women, known as the Boiler Room Girls, were in attendance, their namesake coming from being housed together in a windowless room on Washington's L Street. These women had previously worked as political advisors to Bobby Kennedy, and after his assassination in 1968, had begun working for Ted Kennedy, who at this time was well on his way to becoming the next president. The party started at just before 9 p.m. after the 6 women left their hotel in Edgartown and traveled by ferry to Lawrence Cottage. Included in these women was Mary Jo Kopechne, who was 28 years old at the time and had been instrumental in both Bobby Kennedy's past work and Ted Kennedy's recent success in the political field. A few hours later, at 11 p.m., Mary Jo spoke to Ted and asked him to take her back to the port so she could catch a ferry back to her hotel, claiming that she wasn't feeling very well. After saying goodbye to the rest of the attendees at the party, the pair left shortly thereafter, with Ted deciding to call it a night too and not return afterwards. With Ted driving his black Oldsmobile, the pair were traveling on the main road heading towards the ferry landing where they would go their separate ways. The official story is what follows. While driving, Ted somehow made a wrong turn, careening hard right and ending up on Dyke Road. With some probable whiplash from the sudden turn, the pair barely had enough time to breathe before the narrow wooden dike bridge appeared right in front of them out of the darkness. Ted Kennedy desperately tried to brake, but at over 35 miles per hour, he was going way too fast. The Oldsmobile plunged into the pond, landing in the water below, upside down. Ted was able to quickly get out of the sinking vehicle and safely back on the bridge. He later testified that, quote, "I attempted to open the door and the window of the car, but have no recollection of how I got out of the car," end quote. Mary Jo was not as lucky. Ted claimed that he jumped back in, desperately trying to free her, but the pond current was too strong, and he couldn't see Mary Jo anywhere in the darkness. He ran back to Lawrence Cottage and sought help from his friend, Paul Markham, and his cousin, Gargan. The trio went back to the scene in Paul's car, stripped off, and dove into the water to search for Mary Jo for over 45 minutes. They gave up, and the trio went to the ferry slip and quickly realized that the last ferry had already left for the night. Ted instructed Markham and Gargan to go back to the party, but to not say a word to anyone. And with that, the senator dived into the water and swam over 500 feet to Edgartown, where he went back to his hotel and went to sleep. And I already know what you're thinking at this point. Not a single phone call to the police. What are you hiding? It sounds pretty suspicious. At 9:45 a.m. on July 19th, over 10 hours after the accident, Ted went back to the area and then reported it, admitting that he had been behind the wheel. But the police already knew this. Ted Kennedy's Oldsmobile had been recovered just over an hour earlier when a teacher who was headed out to fish for the day noticed the submerged car and called the police. Edgartown Police Chief Dominic James Arena quickly arrived at the pond and faced the same issues Ted allegedly had the night before. The current was too strong to dive down and retrieve Mary Jo. Divers were called to the scene and alerted to the fact that there was a body trapped in there. John Farrar, the captain of the Edgartown Fire and Rescue Unit, discovered Mary Jo's body in the back seat of the car. Mary Jo was found by the divers with her head pressed up against the floor in the front of the back seat. Farrar would later testify that it is likely that she was positioned like this due to an air pocket having formed after the vehicle was submerged, which allowed Mary Jo to stay alive for some time after the accident before eventually running out of air, suffocating. Suffocating, not drowning. Of course, an autopsy would reveal exactly how Mary Jo died, but an autopsy was not undertaken, and Farrar would never be sure, but he did tell the inquiry later that had he been notified right away, she most likely would have survived. Which asks the question, is this why Ted waited so long to report the accident? Mary Jo was removed from the vehicle and of course pronounced dead at the scene. James Arena noted the registration of the Oldsmobile and discovered it was registered to Ted Kennedy. Ted, after finally reporting the accident, gave a statement to the police and quickly left the area, knowing that the news was going to spread fast. Of course, he was right, and scandal involving the Kennedy family was bound to cause a media circus, and they arrived quickly into Edgartown. The press amassed, harassing both police and the townsfolk desperate to be the first to get the scoop. In order to stabilize the situation, James Arena released Ted's initial statement to the press, something that he had been instructed not to do until the Kennedys' lawyer could look it over. Nevertheless, the news spread like wildfire, and Ted went into hiding, hoping the scandal would ride itself out without too much damage. Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral was held just 4 days after her death on July 22nd. Ted, who had not been seen since the accident, was in attendance and oddly was wearing a neck brace. Knowing the world's eyes were on him, perhaps he tried to get some sympathy if people believed he had been seriously injured in the accident. But the brace only served to distract the public, and he never wore it again. On July 25th, Ted Kennedy pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident after knowingly causing an injury. This was after his lawyers had negotiated for him to plead to the least serious charge that he was facing. Because he pled guilty to even the most minor charge, it meant that Ted would not have to testify in court to the events of July 18th. During the inquest, doubts as to the official timeline were raised when Sheriff Deputy Christopher Look took to the stand. He testified that after his shift ended at 12:30 a.m., he was driving down Chappaquiddick Road when he saw what he later believed to be Ted Kennedy's car parked on the side of the road. Deputy Look went over to the car, initially thinking that it had broken down, and saw a man and woman inside in the front seat for just a split second before the car sped away down Dyke Road. It's speculated that Ted, a married man, believed he had just been seen in a compromising position with a woman who was not his wife. Conveniently, though, because he had already pled guilty, he did not have to answer this, as well as so many other inconsistencies in his timeline. But Ted Kennedy was punished. He had his driver's license suspended for 1 year and received a 2-month suspended sentence. Later that evening, Ted addressed the nation in a televised statement where he described his actions on the evening of July 18th as indefensible, especially in his delayed reporting of the incident, but as a married man, denied that he and Mary Jo had ever been anything but colleagues. Widespread conspiracies had already by this time flooded the country. Ted Kennedy managed to avoid a lot of backlash, and while his presidential dreams had been dashed, he continued to work in politics as Senator of Massachusetts. When Ted died in 2009, he was the second most senior member of the Senate and the third longest serving senator of all time. And of course, when he died, the truth of what happened on July 18th, 1969 died with him. So that was the official line, more or less. But what does the public think of the incident after all of these years? Of course, conspiracies surround the family at every turn, but the most accepted alternate explanation for the incident is both Ted and Mary were drunk and had snuck away to sleep together. always planning to return to the party later. After Deputy Look had seen them both, Ted was scared, knowing his reputation was on the line. He sped off and lost control of the car. He panicked and tried to rescue Mary Jo, but after a couple of fruitless attempts, he thought it was better to stage a cover-up rather than admit both the infidelity and drunk driving if he reported the incident right away. He left, not returning to the party as planned, knowing the other 5 boiler girls would question Mary Jo's absence. He instructed Markham and Gargan to lie about a second attempt at rescue, one that shakily fits into the timeline, and went about constructing an alibi. So what do you think? Simply a series of unfortunate events, or a desperate cover-up to save yet another Kennedy from the brink of political turmoil? That's today's 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for listening today. And this is a story that you just heard that's been stuck in my head for probably my entire life. Growing up, we were an Unsolved Mysteries family. We always watched Unsolved Mysteries, and I think this was on there. I don't remember that far back, but I know for sure that I've seen a documentary about this story when I was way too young to be watching documentaries about this story. But it's super interesting. And again, like I mentioned at the beginning, not per se a murder, but still a story about death. And the conspiracies that surround it make it even more interesting. If you are new to 10-Minute Murder, I hope you enjoyed the episode today and become a subscriber of the podcast. When you do subscribe, you won't miss any future episodes. They'll automatically come to you. And also connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. In the episode notes, you're going to find a list of links. And on each of those links, I'll have where you can follow the show in different places, as well as a link to the merch store if you're interested in t-shirts or stickers or anything like that. If you've got friends and you think that they may be into brief true crime stories like this, please let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Thank you for listening. Be safe and make good choices.